It's a technical term, again. Heretic is a technical term, it's not a derogatory. I would never, I think these people, I would never debate uh, Joseph Sweden or NFT. Like, I think those guys are mentally unhinged. Like, I would never. Why do I have to debate? Like, I'll go over reasons why, like, it's wrong, but like, I have no interest in talking with any of those people. I think they're demonic. I think there's a demonic energy. Uh, they're infiltrated with feds, and like I said, 85% of them are mentally ill. Like, why would this is the same thing? Like, I saw some guy on my Facebook page. Why doesn't Jay Dyer debate the Diamond Brothers? It's like, who in their right mind would want to talk to the Diamond Brothers? I mean, let me put it in perspective. So this guy is actually from Montana. He's a sedevacantist. Um, nice guy. Like, I've never had any personal problems with him. I think he actually went to Calvary Chapel too, so we have a kind of common history. There's a set of a contest priest that comes up here. He's from like Louisiana or something like that, and he serves the sedes. And I think it was last year. I met him at the. I think a bunch of the sedes went up to, like, they have like a homeschool group, and there's always school kid like at the ski, like they do like ski days, different schools, junior high schools even read. I don't think Father Joe, like, he's done what's first of all, nice is not a virtue. Nice usually means covering, like, it's usually something fake. I think these people are subversives. They constantly pretend. You see them in the chat too. They come in, these schismatics, these old calendarists, pretending that they're actually Orthodox. And they'll come into the chat and they ask, like, it looks like they're just curious asking questions. And then the questions start to get more aggressive, and then they accuse you of, being heretics because you're quote unquote in communion with a heretic. Um, what's so stupid, again, let's go back to the actual use, the technical use of the terms. Somebody can hold a heresy. Many people do, some formally, some materially. Most people hold some material heresy. Formal is when they're accountable, like they should know better. Um, but they're not heretics in the technical sense until they get their day in court, right? It has to be publicly, like, we have to see the arguments, we have to see the defense and their excommunicate, so, and declared heretics formally. So that's why I give the analogy. Yeah, of course, the person either, let's say there's a criminal, a crime, a murder. They're obviously a murderer, they're not. But they deserve their day in court, right? They deserve a defense. Um, no matter how imperfect the legal system is, we can't just have individuals becoming vigilantes and declaring they're publicly a heretic. And that's why I said we had a guy in here. It's so ad hoc. This is what I mean. These people, like, you can see it's not an intellectual issue. I can intuit a demonic energy to these people. that they create these ad hocs. It's a donatism, right? Donatism was the idea that a priest or bishop's sins would excommunicate them and give them they wouldn't have the authority, they'd be invalid. And so this is the same thing, like a bishop holding to heresies doesn't invalidate and doesn't not make him a bishop until he's formally excommunicated, until he gets the public trial. And there's a reason for that, whether it's personal sin, and sins of actions or sins that are heresies. Is it's not fair to the laity and the rest that because of the sins of the priest or the bishop, that the people be held accountable for that. And they don't get the sacrament, so they don't have a bishop. Okay. And so it also preserves against, if that's actually criteria, if holding to a heresy invalidates you from your clerical rankings and the validity of the sacraments and being in the church, well, congratulations, you never know where the church is because you have no idea when any priest or bishop might hold something secret, privately, a heresy. So if you follow through just how anarchical the schismatics argument actually is. So God, a good God who loves man, has grace. It says, I'll cover that as long as they're in the ark. Even the sins will not withhold the grace, as St. Basil says, of the Holy Spirit for the people. All right? So this guy comes in and be like, oh, that just is sins of action. Well, we're not Donatists because those are sin. You don't? Are you an idiot? You don't think heresy is a sin? Do you see what these people? It's just like the other thing too. How many schismatic parishes are there? There's Etna, there's Colorado, there's one on the East Coast. None of these people are going to church. This is smaller than sedevacantism. And you guys are listening to these people's arguments who don't go to church. They're keyboard warriors. Has a kind of legalism and fanaticism. They're mostly mentally like I just kid. That's what I don't. I talked to Jay about this. I'm like, I don't know what's worse. Some of the people pushing these positions online or the people believing it. Like, and you know what orthodoxy, and this is a weird puritanicalism. It's just, again, it's like papal legalism. Well, I built my ethereal, platonic, theological Dungeons and Dragons, and I got everything right, and it's totally pure and immune from any error and heresy and Masonic influence. And I subscribe to this intellectual set of propositions, and I'm pure. And they're not even going to church. I mean, like, give me a break, dude. And you guys are falling for that? I don't, help me out here. I don't get it. Yeah, no, great. I love that line. The old and new calendar is not the issue. There are legitimate canonical churches that are both new and old calendar. The old calendarists is not just simply being on the old calendar. They've separated themselves from the Orthodox Church, and you can't do that. The church has always been synodal. Scripture, I've been loving, like, and there are these accounts that they just make to keep coming on it. I'll keep blocking you, like, and removing you from the channel. I have no. Scripture says, have nothing to do with a contentious man. Why do you guys think that I need to actually have a dialogue and win? Like, I can tell. Just like heretics, there's no argument or debate that you're going to give these people that's going to win them over. For a heretic and somebody that's like, remember, heresy is not getting something intellectually right. It's an issue of the heart and pride. Nothing can be evidence against their position. Everything's evidence for the position. Just don't talk to these. If somebody's like that, why are you wasting your time on? So this guy says, let me see. I deleted him because I have no interest in talking. But in case you, the audience, are curious, I don't mind going over. Where did you get the idea, he says, for the standard? Why the ad hominems? Do you probably don't even know what an ad hominem is? I always like to say somebody's attack of character, attacking one's character or pointing out character flaws is not an ad hominem. Somebody calls somebody retarded. It's not an ad hominem. Here's the difference. You're retarded, therefore your argument is false and retarded. That's an ad hominem. Your argument is retarded, therefore you're demonstrating your retardedness, you're probably a retard, is not an ad hominem. We bring people on into court to establish character. That's not an ad hominem to be like, this person is not a trustworthy person. How is communion with the patriarch the sine qua non being in the church? Thinks he just makes it like it's rooted in scripture and the canons and the fathers in history. Let me put it back on you. Where do we ever see a lone bishop not in communion with other bishops? Where do we ever see legitimizing the history of church parachurches established? Well, I'm legit because I had apostolic succession. Well, first of all, your argument is if you're even in contact or communion with a heretical bishop, invalidates it. So you have no argument for your schismatic, because none of your orders are valid, because there's always been a time in history that we've been in communion with some bishop that's been a heretic. So congratulations. Number two, we don't see anywhere in the history of the church where somebody can set up a parachurch because they, apart from the synod, apart from the judgments of the church, for your puritanicalism. In fact, just the opposite. We see rooted in scripture where two or more gathered, there I'll be. That's synodality. It doesn't say, well, if you just get all your theology correct, then you could be orthodox. Tertullian famously said, one Christian is no Christian. You're not Christian. I'm sorry. Like, it doesn't matter if you got all the theology correct. In Acts, it shows synodality. In the canons, it shows, I could go over. So, scriptural precedent. So, there is literally no precedent for what the schismatics are saying. Just the opposite. So there's a scriptural precedent in Acts 15. There's a patristic teachings, for example, St. Cyprian, St. Ignatius. It's in the canonical texts, the apostolic canons, Nicaea 1, Chalcedon, right? Isn't it funny? They think that they're the keepers of the canons, but they cherry pick like every other heretic, or like heretics. I don't know if I'd technically call them heretics, they're in schism. I'll pick this out of context, ignore all the rest of the canons, and then reframe, right, and re-explain what that means to fit my position against your position. Can you guys not notice that they're doing this? Also, I mean, a very Trinitarian theology is synodal. St. Ignatius, look up St. Ignatius, Apostolic Canons, Apostolic Canon 34, 35. Talks about the role of the bishop, like how he functions, synod, in terms of synodality, ecumenical councils, Nicaea discusses this, Canon 2, the Second Ecumenical Council, defining the boundaries in synodality, Chalcedon, Canon 19, requires the bishop to regularly meet and term in a synod. Also, this relates to like when the Roman Catholics were like, well, your bishop said Muslims and Christians worship the same God. And I pointed out, first of all, it's not my bishop. Number two, because Patriarch Kirill might have been saying something diplomatically as a head of state, right, representing the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia, to be diplomatic because of the issues of Muslims doesn't even follow that he actually personally believes that. Even if he did, a bishop and a patriarch cannot bind dogmatic. They can't administratively and do stuff like that. It's the synod. So a bishop has his authority through a synod, conciliarity, not by himself. And it's also witnessed in his ordination too. The apostolic canon 4, canon 1 of the apostolic canons, canon 4 of Nicaea, that 2 or 3 other bishops are required to ordain. So you don't have sole bishops. And we're going to go over this. It's like, where do you find, it's like, this is what I mean. Like, why have conversations with these sorts of people? Noah Strong is $20. Wow, much appreciated, Father Deacon. Thank you so much. I'm going to pull up this. Father Peter hears. Father Peter hears gives a good response.
Ecumenism is, of course, a problem.
And look in the chat, all the schismatics, none of them even listen to the argument. They don't address the argument. They're all doing red herrings and other arguments. So I find that interesting. But I want to show you.
Ecumenism is, of course, a problem in the Go Arch and other jurisdictions. How can you hold the global Orthodox position, critique ecumenism, and not go true Orthodox? So the answer is that the saints from all ages have resisted heresy. and teach others to resist heresy. And even there is canons that even support the cessation of commemoration of your bishop, only your bishop. That's Canon 15 of the First Second Council. There are examples of that in church history, but it's not to set up a parallel jurisdiction. It's not to break off.
Yeah, see? Is there any precedent within church history where you set up a parallel, the break off and set a parallel jurisdiction? In fact, there's canons forbidding that, which they ignore. We'll get into this later.
Off and then turn around and before a council, before a condemnation of the particular heresy that's risen, to essentially become a sectarian and break off from all the Orthodox who are also struggling against ecumenism. It does not support the idea that if one bishop teaches heresy in your bishop or a bishop in your jurisdiction teaches heresy, or even 10 bishops teach heresy, therefore the entire Orthodox local church of whatever, Romania, Constantinople.
Yeah, where did they get this? I mean, did anybody even question out, like, where does that come from? Like, oh, I just made it up.
Antioch is therefore lost. And there are many instances in church history where we have large numbers of people apostatizing to a particular heresy. Iconoclasm was the most obvious. Arianism was a major.
I want to bring up another example why they're not Orthodox. If what they're saying is true, and you can just flee a heretical bishop and set up your own kind of parallel church, there's no need for synods and ecumenical councils. So they don't actually believe in ecumenical councils. Isn't that interesting? So how could you be Orthodox if you don't actually believe in ecumenical councils? Because you could just do it. That's what councils and synods are for. To be able to publicly address and condemn and excommunicate heretics. Well, if you can just do it on your own, then there's no need for it. And if you say there's no need, how can you be Orthodox to say there's no need for ecumenical councils? We don't need them. They're just an accidental decoration, a historical decoration of the church.
Example, there was false unions with the Monophysites. There was the false unions with Rome, two major false unions with Rome where there were major times of apostasy. So the Orthodox patristic response to heresy cannot be justified.
And notice what I like what Father Pierre's bringing up too is part of our sources of dogma is the patristic witness and the witness of the saints. Do we have any saints that did this? No. Do we have any patristic? No. You literally have only schismatics. And what's really interesting, they actually reject our saints. They do not accept, they have no saints of their own, which should tell you something, that they're not holy people. They didn't produce any saints. It's like Protestantism, right? Like, is there any saints? No, there might be like some decent people, right? That by like the same sense we'd call like a Protestant, like, you know, they act saintly or something, but then like they don't actually produce saints. And they actually reject and talk terrible about Saint Joseph the Heskis, Saint Paisios. They're against Father Seraphim Rose. Like, does that not tell you something? They don't actually accept them.
In doing what the so-called old calendars or the true Orthodox have done. It's not the patristic response. The saints of our day haven't done that. And proof of this is at least in the following, that the so-called true Orthodox or genuine Orthodox do not recognize the sanctity, the saintliness, the holiness of major saints who also opposed ecumenism, who are not ecumenists, did not participate in ecumenism, were opposed to ecumenism, like Saint Paisius of the Holy Mouth, Saint Ephrem of Katonakia, Saint Joseph the Hesychist, Saint Evmenios, Saint Porphyrios, and many, many others. I mean, just one of the saints that's celebrated by the so-called true Orthodox, Saint Seraphim of Sofia, went to a Sergianist council in Moscow, which was against ecumenism, but he was there communing with those who other saints in Russia had eschewed any kind of.
I mean, so you guys are convinced by their arguments? I mean, they literally deny saints, and you're like, these are the people I want to join up with.
Communion with. So the simplistic approach, really, ultimately, the methodology, the way of the some at least on the far right or those who've erred on the right, their methodology actually meets. I just gave a lecture in Cyprus about this. It'll come out eventually in English. That ecumenism, philetism, and zealotism actually meet in many ways methodologically, and resemble one another in different ways, and they're all falling away from the royal patristic path of the saints. So the minute you don't follow the saints of our day that came before us in our time, and you separate yourself not only from those teaching heresy, but the saints themselves, you're not following the saints that have come before us. And that's the cornerstone, that's the touchstone of orthodoxy, is that we follow the Holy Fathers before us. So that's one of the main reasons that methodologically it does not hold. We're not following the saints and the fathers of our day or those of ancient times. And I'll just give you one example, and then Constantine can jump in if he wants. Go to the 4th century. Go to the post-First Ecumenical Council period. Go to the 370s, 60s, 70s, and go to 3 saints that were all post-First Ecumenical Council, all elected in part by Arians. They thought that they were going to have an Arian position. They were a part of the local church in some way, in some fashion. They were a part because they were electing these bishops. And I'm talking about St. Ambrose of Milan, St. Meletios of Antioch, and St. Cyril of Jerusalem. Great saints. St. Meletios was a spiritual father, ordained St. Basil the Great. He was celebrated at the Second Ecumenical Council. He was the president of the Second Ecumenical Council. He was celebrated by all the saints and the elders and the fathers there. St. John Chrysostom received the ordination in his hands, I believe. And so this is father of fathers, and yet he was elected in part by Arians who thought he was going to have an Arian position. You can't make sense of that with the true / GOC position today. It's overly simplistic and ignores church history. You can't make sense of that. You would, if you had their position ecclesiologically, you would be among those who rejected St. Meletios in Antioch, who some of them who did later on. There was a schism there. So it's just not, following the fathers is not accurate. It's simplistic. It takes statements that were made by saints, separate from all heresy. It takes those statements and it applies them incorrectly.
Yep. I'm going to show, we're going to go over another article too. And if you read the comments, like none of them actually address what Father Peter here has actually said. Because they want their position no matter what. Even if that means denying the saints, ignoring all the arguments and creating your own crazy idea. Let's see. No, they've turned on Seraphim Rose now. You didn't know that? Like, I don't know if every single one of them, but that's the new thing now. Now they're criticizing Father Seraphim Rose. So, and debate the people. True Orthodox is the... Throw a stone and then run. Speaking about... But yeah, I'll take you seriously when you go to your local mental hospital and start debating. Who told you have to debate every person that challenges? Does Father Peter Hears now have to? Is he obliged because some rando on the internet says you have to? Like, who sent you? What's your authority and expertise to actually say we have to debate. This is the type of stuff and people that you get, and people think like, and then wonder like why I don't want to talk to them. I mean, is this not the same thing that like all the atheists and instead of you're afraid of the diamond, bro? It's like, do I look afraid? Have I ever lost a debate? You think I'm actually afraid? It's called being prudent and using discernment. Well, I'm surprised, Father Peter. I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have done it. All right. Yeah. Remember this? This is sort of people. This is who you want to actually like. People like the Isfigmenu monastery, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Amanathos was the schismatic. Um, and they got evicted. So what do they do? They actually had to have the Greek government because they're actually evicted from by Mount Athos itself, and this. Well, they arm themselves with Molotov cocktails and start throwing it at like. Um, well, old calendars cite other issues. Say the issue that caused this. So the reason why they're called old calendars was originally the calendar issue. The issue that caused those groups to go into schism was a change of the calendar. So is the new calendar a heresy? Father John, and I'm not on the new calendar either. Neither is Father John. He says he does not believe the new calendar should have been introduced unless every local. Yeah, we all agree. Those in the old calendar agree. Changing the fixed calendar to the new calendar, but continue to use the old calendar to determine the dates of Pascha causes liturgical chaos. I agree with that too. The Typicon was not written with such a strange mix in mind. Personally, I think it would make far more sense to change the entire calendar so it worked with the Typicon. As it is, you have Lenten commemorations occurring before Lent, such as the Feast of the 40 Martyrs of Sebastian. You have Paschal commemorations occurring. Yeah, it's just kind of chaotic. Despite these issues, it cannot be successfully argued the new calendar is a heresy. And according to the canons, its only heresy preached clearly and unequivocally. That is sufficient basis for separating from your lawful bishop, or bishop separate. Now, what it doesn't mean is go set up your, like, you can separate from your bishop and you go to another. It doesn't say set up your own para church. You ask an old calendar the canonical basis of their schism, they'll point to Cant 15 of the First and Second Council of Constantinople held in 861, which states in part, but as for those persons, on the other hand, who, on account of some heresy condemned by the holy councils or fathers, withdrawing themselves from communion with their president, who, that is to say, is preaching the heresy publicly and teaching it barehead in church, such persons not only are subject to canonical penalty on account of having walled themselves off from any and all communion with the one called a bishop before a conciliar synodal verdict, but have rendered has been rendered, but on the contrary, they shall be deemed worthy to enjoy honor, which befits them among Orthodox Christians, for they have defied not bishops, but the pseudo-bishops and pseudo-teachers, and they have not surrounded the union of the church with any schism, but on the contrary, have been seduced to rescue the church from schisms and divisions. Okay, so they quote that, and what do? They cherry pick and they don't look at the other canons. But here's another basis that's often appealed to, is the example of Saint Theodore the Studite, who broke communion with the Patriarch Constable because he allowed the emperor to enter into a fourth marriage, which is certainly contrary to the well-established tradition of the church. This controversy known as the Mohican controversies, which means Moicos is adulterer, because Saint Theodore considered this marriage to be nothing more than adultery. During the controversy, Saint Theodore the Studite briefly separated himself from the two patriarchs who are also saints of the church. The fact that he separated from two saints of the church suggests that the example is not one that is so clear cut that one could base a great deal on. Aside from that, a few decades after the proposal of St. Theodore, the First and Second Synod was called in Constantinople, and while they did say the bishop preaching heresy bareheaded in the church was ground for schism, they made it very clear that personal sins or canonical were not a sufficient basis for schism. Canon 13 of that council states, "But all evil one, having planted the seed of heretical terrors in the Church of Christ, and seeing these being cut down to the roots with the sword of the Spirit, took a different course of trickery by attempting to divide the body of Christ by means of madness of the schismatics. But checking even this plot, the Holy Church has declared that henceforth, if any presbyter or deacon, on alleged ground that his own bishop has been condemned for certain crimes, before consideration or hearing an investigation has been made, should dare to secede from his communion and fail to mention his name in the sacred prayers of the liturgical service in accordance with the custom handed down to the church, he shall be subject to proper disposition from office and stripped of every prelatic honor." Oh wow! Don't bring that one. Isn't it convenient? It literally, you couldn't get more clear. Well, they ignore that, Canon 13, right? They pick the ones and reinterpret it and present it to you in their package that they want and ignore the rest. Where have we seen that before? For anyone who has been established in the rank of presbyter forestalls the Metropolitan judgment judging matters before a trial. Everybody gets their day in court, you vigilantes. Insofar as lies in his power, condemns his own father and bishop, he is not worthy the honor or name of presbyter. Those, on the other hand, who go along with him in the case of them should be among those in the holy orders. They too shall forfeit their rights to honor. In a case they should be monks or laymen, let them utterly be excommunicated from the church, obviously in a council, as they spew upon. So yeah, if you're complicit in that, and you get your, it's brought up to a synod, you will also be condemned. Canon 14 and excommunicated. Canon 14 says, if any bishop on the allegation that charges of crime lie against his own metropolitan shall secede or apostatize from him before a conciliar synodal verdict has been issued against him, and shall abstain from communion with him and fail to mention his name in accordance with the consuetude in the course of the divine mystagogy, the liturgical celebration, the Holy Council has decreed that he shall be deposed from office. If merely by seceding from his metropolitan he shall create a schism. For everyone ought to know his own bounds, neither ought a presbyter to treat his own bishop scornfully contemptuous, nor ought a bishop to treat his own metropolitan. Essentially, this says that what goes for deacons and priests goes for the bishop in his deal with the metropolitan too. Canon 15. The rules laid down with reference to presbyters and bishops and metropolitans are still more applicable to patriarchs. So in any case, a presbyter or bishop or metropolitan dares to secede or apostatize in the communion of his own patriarch and fails to mention the latter's name in accordance with the customary duty fixed and ordained, the divine mystagogy but before conciliar verdict has been pronounced and passed, judgment against him creates a schism. The Holy Council has decreed that this person shall be held an alien to every priestly function, if only he be convicted of having committed this transgression of the law. Accordingly, these rules have been sealed and ordained as respecting those persons under the pretext and charges against their own presence stands aloof and create a schism and disrupt the union of the church. But as for those persons, on the other hand, who would on account of some heresy condemned by the old councils or fathers, withdrawing themselves from communion with their own president, who, that is to say, is preaching the heresy publicly and teaching it bareheaded in the church, such persons are not only subject to any canonical penalty on account of their having walled themselves off from any communion with the one called a bishop before a conciliar synodal verdict has been rendered, but on the contrary, they shall be deemed worthy of the honor benefits among Orthodox churches, for they have defied not bishops but the pseudo bishops. So remember, they're taking this out of context, right? And so what was said in the previous canons about separating from bishop metropolitan is all more applicable to the patriarch. There is only one exception given here, and that is when one separates from their bishop, metropolitan, patriarch on the basis of a heresy that is publicly taught by the church. The canon does not say that it is justified merely on the grounds that a bishop holds a heretical opinion. It also does not say it is justified because such a heretical opinion might be inferred from the actions or vaguely worded statements, which is exactly what they do. It is only when the heresy has been condemned by the fathers or councils, as talked and bareheadedly, these canons coming as they do in the wake of the Moekian controversy were clearly designed to ensure that another such controversy would not occur. They clearly define the only basis of schism prior to conciliar verdict, and that is clear preaching of heresy. Furthermore, even this canon does not provide for the establishment of parallel jurisdictions. So again, if you did that, you're still, the case in point would be the issue of the filioque and stuff like that, and separating from Rome. But they were, right? Constantinople was in communion with the rest of the patriarchs. They didn't go and set their own parallel jurisdiction prior to a conciliar verdict. In other words, you could withdraw from communion from a bishop who's preaching heresy. You can do that. But until the church deals with the matter, you have no grounds of establishing rival synods, as the Greek will count it. Now, getting back to the monks in Esphigmino. While all the monastery mountains have at times raised objections to actual statement of the ecumenical patriarch, and while they have all remained on the old calendar, all of them remain in communion with the rest of the church, except for that monastery. Because unfortunately attracted the most extreme monks. Yeah, exactly. It's the only people that fall for these arguments, like I said, are usually people with mental illnesses and extremists. Like, why would you want to join with that group? There have been other examples of Orthodox governments using military force to remove heretical and schismatic monks from the minds, but I think it would have been better in this case that ecumenical period to focus their attention on removing the points of scandal that inspired these monks to take the extreme. Yeah. Okay. Here's another read. Anti-patristic, the stance of the zealot, old calendarist by monk Basil. And these things. I think that's sufficient too. So notice that like the keepers, the old calendarists, the keepers of the canons, shockingly and surprisingly, I'm being facetious here, ignore the canons. They reject the saints. They reject the patristic witness of the church. What's going on? Why is this thing there? Con, did I not just answer literally everything that Dalton 499 might be a dead horse, but what do you make of St. Paul making a case for natural theology? No, it's not anywhere close to natural theology. It's called natural revelation. Natural theology, as defined by the West, is blasphemous. It says literally, what the human mind by the natural light of reason alone can know about God apart from divine revelation. So you have to say, first, that there's no divine revelation in nature. Like, it's blasphemous. And what I mean, you see that what my mind can know without God. It's like it becomes clear. It's like obviously that's not what St. Paul. Does it mean cosmological arguments? Because St. Paul talks about that all are without excuse. It doesn't say like, well, those that went and took philosophy and studied Aquinas's ways, um, are without excuse. Even little children. So, infants and little children know God through divine revelation in nature. You just say you can go away from a heretical bishop if everyone accepts an innovation. What then? Well, then Christ comes back, I guess. Like, if you're asking me, like, what if there's no bishops whatsoever? I, they never listen. Notice they'll never address the canons. They'll never address what they bring up. Well, what abouts? What aboutism? What about this? What are you? I'm not even going to begin to answer that until you actually deal with the issue of the canons. You're uncanonical. It literally says you can't do that. They don't believe in ecumenical councils. Why? Because in the Arian heresy that lasted a lot longer than quote unquote ecumenism, and that's not a bareheaded, again, it's wrong. What Christological heresy is ecumenism? It has to be clearly defined in accordance and condemned by in a clear way. Not I'm extrapolating on something that's actually wrong, and it is wrong, like we all said. Like, yeah, ecumenism's wrong. It does not fit in the same category. And again, it's just like Father Peter here said, it's simple-minded. I'm not answering any of your questions because until you answer, you deal with the issue. They're all red herrings. You guys are always the same. You don't believe in ecumenical councils. You didn't address any of the prior. There's more fundamental arguments than whatabouts. Notice that these guys always whatabouts. I don't have to answer that. You start with the fundamentals. So on your thing, we could have separated from the Arian before an ecumenical council. Congratulations. I love you're showing how foolish your system is. What about this? What about deal with what I brought up? You're anti-canonical. You violate the canons. You violate the saints. You don't accept the saints. You don't accept ecumenical councils. You don't accept the history of the church. Deal with that, and then we can have a conversation.